Welcome back to the Long Way Back podcast. I'm your host, Timmy Long, joined today
by Tommy Long. Hi, lads.
So today we have a very special guest, Eddie Mullins. Eddie was a governor in the Midlands prison while I was there. Tommy was there. He's now the CEO of Merchants Quay Ireland.
Yeah.
And we're going to have a chat with him. So you're going to give us a brief description of how it was, Eddie, growing up in inner city Dublin, and then going through the years rolling into the getting going.
I'm a proud Dub, I have to say. I feel a little bit uncomfortable here in the real capital, as I say. But I was born in Dublin 8, which would have been part of the Liberties. Born in the Coombe Hospital is actually where I was officially born, but family of eight siblings, two parents, mother and father. We lived in a 3-bedroom corporation house. I went to school in James Street CBS, and I suppose when I was around 14 or 15, we moved out to a place called Rathcoole. Rathcoole is County Dublin, so it was near the Kildare border. And then went to school in James Street. Wasn't the best person at school. I didn't really like school. I liked the crack, but I wasn't really, I never found myself, I wasn't academic. So when I left school, did the Leaving Cert, didn't pass it. At the time, it was you either passed or you failed. You know, now you talk about points, there's no such thing as failing, but you needed to get 5 passes, 5 Ds to pass your Leaving Cert. And I got 4. So I failed the Leaving Cert officially. And but a neighbour of my father's in Rathcoole was a chef instructor. And it's kind of ironic because he used to always say, this fella will end up behind bars if we don't get him a job. Yeah. Right? So I did technically end up behind bars. So he got me a chef's course in Rockwell, which was a private school, but there was also a catering college in it. And actually I was just telling Tommy on the way down there, I pulled into Rockwell because 40 years ago this weekend, I started my apprenticeship as a chef in Rockwell. So that was just, and it just happened to be coincidental driving down. I said, Jesus, this is the same time as so it was 40 years ago this weekend when I started it. So went to Rockwell, did 2 years there, and then had various jobs as a chef. And then I would call myself a very reluctant prison officer. My wife's father was a trades officer. She wasn't my wife at the time, she was my girlfriend at the time, and I was working as a chef, but kind of chefing was never the most secure career, and it was always, you're moving around from job to job, and so my wife said, why don't you apply for the prison service? And I applied for it, and at the time, there was a lot of people applied to the prison service at the time, so they used to hold aptitude tests, so you'd go into, remember my aptitude test was in a GAA club in Finglas, Aaron's Oil GAA club. And the morning of it, I said, this is not for me, and I didn't go. And I was telling the girlfriend that evening, she said, you have to go. So she phoned up the civil service and told them I missed the bus. And they gave me another date, and I went and got through the aptitude test and went for an interview and got called to start in the prison service. And right up to, I remember we went to Mallorca for a week before I was due to start, starting in July 1991, and right up to the week before, I said, this is not for me. I'm not going to take it. And then she kept saying, just give it one day or give it 1 week. And 1 week, 32 years later, I retired last year from it. So
do you go into trade straight away?
No, I didn't go into trade. I went in as a prison officer.
Yeah,
did
not
the training.
In the kitchens or anything like that.
Because I was a chef, I went into the kitchen pretty soon.
Okay.
Then went from the kitchen to industrial manager, which would be in charge of workshops, and then industrial manager, assistant governor, and then governor, and then ended up. So I was governor of 5 prisons. I was the governor of Loughan House, was my first prison.
Was it?
Yeah, I loved Loughan, have to say.
It was a nice spot.
Yeah, good spot. Loughan House. Then ended up in Mountjoy, Midlands, Portlaoise, and back to Mountjoy. In Wheatfield. Yeah, so I did the 5. Yeah, so yeah.
So you had a big variety. Every prison is so different.
It's like a different city.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. They all have their own particular
identity. Some are calmer than others.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
What would you say is the thing that kept you there longer than that week?
My wife.
Was it?
Yeah, I'd say, if I'm honest.
You got the warm nights.
Yeah, I'd say, look, you get used to everything. Yeah. I always remember in 1991 when I came out of Balad, as we used to call it. That was the training centre, Loughan House in Portlaoise. Posted to St. Pat's, and probably 2 or 3 weeks after I went to St. Pat's, there was a riot in Mountjoy, and it was a serious riot, and the 1991 riot. And I remember being sent down from Pat's. It was a Monday, and I remember going down Monday around maybe mid-morning, and the tension was building and building and building, and it was very obvious that something was going to happen. And at 2 o'clock then, when the cells were unlocked, lads on, I think it was the A wing at the time, they were moving towards the yard, and they all got up onto the roof. Now, when I say they didn't all, obviously, but there was a very significant number got up onto the roof, and that was when it started. And pulling the slates off the roof, and it was live. RTE were relaying it live on the news. The news didn't have a live news channel then, but there was reports of this. So it was a very significant riot. But I always remember it ended probably around 10 o'clock that night. I remember getting into my car and driving up the North Circle Road, and it kind of hit me, and I pulled in, and I remember my stomach was heaving, and the next minute I vomited out onto the road. I said, oh my God, what have I just experienced here? Yeah. And I remember going home and saying, I'm not going back to this. And I went back anyway. I don't know how I just decided to go back the next day, and that was it then, you just move on. So, but it was a pretty, it was a strange experience, and I was very raw at the time, wouldn't have been used to that at all,
And prison, like for prison officers, myself and Tommy have came across some fantastic people, where they really treat you like another human being, and you get some that are maybe not. Unfortunately. And that's very fair. I understand this. Yeah. Tommy understands this, but it can be challenging when somebody's locked up for prison and they're doing, it's tough as it is because they're away from their families and everything else, but I suppose you're there to answer for whatever crimes you're after committing, and that's fair enough. But what kind of prison officer would you say you were? I
was the nice one. I know, yeah. To be honest with you, well, look, I one of the things, even in the role I'm in now, several lads that I would have met in Mountjoy or in Wheatfield or any of the prisons, and they'll be using Merchant's Key for service, the service we provide, and we'd always have a good relationship. I've never had a bad encounter. Never had a bad encounter with anybody who'd been in prison. Now, you're right, you get people with different personalities. Some people have the personality to be a prison officer and some don't, and some people are in the wrong job. That's the reality of it. But I think that's probably in every walk of life. No, the prison service is probably no different. But I certainly never had a difficulty. And I think I always treated people with dignity and respect. And I think when you do that, you'll get it back. Even from the hardest, you'll get it back.
100%. And I seen you as the governor in Mountjoy, and I seen there was a serious part of your job as well, but you didn't take life too serious or the job too serious. No. And I think the lads, like we done workshops, myself and James, and I think the lads appreciated that, and they could have a bit of crack with you. Yeah. And there was a lot of, I noticed there was a lot of respect from both. Yeah. Because you were giving it back to them as well. Yeah. And I think it made life so much easier, not for just you and your prison officers, for everybody.
Yeah, I fully agree. And, I think, I remember actually when one of the first people, and I'm going to say one of the first people, it probably wasn't, but one of the first memories I have, I remember going down to the kitchen in Mountjoy to collect the bread. Right, so the bread used to be baked in the bakery actually. I'm going down to collect the bread for St. Pat's. Very early on, it was probably only a couple of weeks in. And the first guy I met was a neighbour of mine. Right now, he was a childhood neighbour. Right, so as I said, I had 8 siblings. I still have 8 siblings, thank God. 7 siblings and myself. There's 8 of us all together. And the house attached, it was a row of terrace houses. But our next door neighbour, they were a family of 2 siblings. And they would have been considered wealthy. Now, they weren't wealthy, but relative to everybody else, they had a business, a small business, and they were considered very comfortable and wealthy. And there's a boy and a girl in the family. And I met the lad he was the same age as my brother, so he was probably about 4 or 5 years older than me, but I knew him all my life, And he had unfortunately developed a drug habit. Okay. And he ended up driving a getaway car. But he was very unfortunate because I think it was a heroin habit he had, and he then developed HIV and he passed away. So he wasn't one of the lucky ones because the treatments weren't there. So there wasn't the kind of medical, supports that you have now. Like HIV now is nothing like what it was back in the 80s and 90s. But I always think like, that could have easily been me.
Yeah.
Easily been me, And I don't say that in any noble way or in any, I'm a great fella or anything like that, but I know it could have been me.
Because you understand it.
Oh, totally.
You understand the difference between living in one house and not living 2 doors down.
Absolutely.
And how somebody turns out can be so different. Yeah. It's all about like the household, the environment, the people.
And there's a bit of luck too.
There is a bit of luck.
There's a bit of luck.
And how so different two people's lives can be because of the two different environments.
Well, if I'm honest, right, I look at the way I am as a person, right, and I would have been, if you look at my time in school or anything, I would have been a bit of a messer. I would have been easily led. And I'm convinced the 2 years in Rockwell, because that kind of coincided with the explosion of drug use in Dublin, especially in the city centre. So when I left school, like there wasn't a drug problem, right? But 2 years later, there was a massive drug problem. 3 years later, there was a massive drugs problem. And it's likely, had I not gone to Tipperary and trained as a chef, I'd have been stuck right in the middle of that when that was exploding. And look, who knows? I don't know what
it was one bad day.
That's all it was. And it is a poor decision that you make on one occasion that can actually
change your
set out
life.
your life. So, I don't know.
And it's like that, isn't it? Even I was just thinking, I was saying, you were a bit of a messer and stuff growing up. I'm saying if you came across Tommy anyway when you were growing up, he would have been a complete different story.
I can imagine.
Yeah, I was definitely a messer as a kid, and I used just loved the madness. I used to get a thrill out of being given out too. And like in school then as well, I was an awful messer.
Did you ever come across Tommy in the Midlands?
Well, I can't say I did, Tommy.
I'm fully sure I was in front of you for a P19.
And I would say I was very fair, was I?
You give me a couple of nights anyway.
I can imagine what the P19 knows for.
It was only a couple of nights. It wasn't too bad either.
Yeah.
I actually, we spent nearly 2 years in the Midlands together, and I barely seen him. He was 3-4 south. He spent most of his time running away and hiding from me in the landings because I was sober, and Tommy was doing his thing.
I was on one in there, and I'd be dodging him. If I was all right, I'd come out and say good night and this and that. If I was on one, then I just look in his flap and good night and gone. He'd pull me then the next morning and say, you were out of it again last night. I wasn't.
Who's old? Are you older than me?
I'm older by 2.5 years. Then there's Tommy, and then there's John Paul. He's the third one of us, and he's doing well as well.
Yeah, thank God.
Three of us now are doing really, really well, getting our lives together. We like our story is. It's just been addiction, poor mental health since the moment we grew. We were the guy 2 doors down from you.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the way. Like we grew up in an environment that was challenging. Yeah. We had a single parent who had her own issues. Yeah, and she done the best that she could to bring us up in the best way she could, and we went down Ground Road from a young age. I went to treatment at the age of 15. In other homes from a young age. Didn't go to prison until I was in maybe my late teens, early 20s, because I was gone for so long. I was into treatment for 2.5 years in France, and came back and went back on the drinking drugs. But there was an awful violence came out of me when I had alcohol in my system and prescribed meds. And it kind of went mad, but the three of us, like with me being the oldest, the boys just kind of followed my footsteps then, and it was just natural for them to follow me.
Yeah, you were the example.
Exactly. And the example ahead of me were the lads in the estate, my father, who had been in prison, and my uncle being in prison. We looked up to these guys. We didn't have the teacher or someone that had a good job two doors down that could kind of pull me aside to me like, you're going down the wrong road. But internally, I knew I was a good person.
Yeah,
I always knew that, Eddie. And I knew that, but like we had to survive in the best way we possibly could. And survival was going out in the streets and using drugs to be able to soothe us from and get us away from what was going on in our heads and away from what was going on internally for us emotionally. But you know,
and there's an expectation you have to do it, don't you? Because I was talking to a lad in Dublin who does a bit of work with us, and he was describing his brother. His brother was, I think, he's lost his life to a really violent situation, but he was telling me, you know, how much. And like that, he said, I knew deep down, and they used to say he was a bit soft. He's not in any way soft. He's been in and out of prison. He's a great role model for people like yourselves. He's really, you know, he's used his experience to help as many people as he possibly can. But he described situations where he just couldn't show emotion. He said, I just couldn't. And my brother would say to me, I'm warning you now, do not show any emotion in this situation. You had to stand, you had to portray this hardness that. He said, and it was difficult for him, you know.
Yeah.
So
And it is challenging.
Yeah.
It can be challenging because for somebody that grew up in an environment that we did, to show emotion is kind of sign of weakness. And what that would mean then, when you show a weakness, people will see the weakness and they'd use that then against you.
Yeah.
Or else they'd attack you emotionally or maybe mentally or physically.
Of course.
You don't put it, yeah. But yeah, it was difficult. But listen, would I change? I'm in a position now in my life, Eddie, that I look at my past as in probably one of the best things that ever happened to me. And I don't say that in weird way, and I mean that truly. But my past gave me a sense of strength that got me through the last few years.
Yeah.
And if I didn't have that, I don't think I would have survived it. And I always say this, right? When I look back at my childhood, and I don't think I've said this before on the podcast, my hero is my young self.
Yeah.
And he is today, because how I got through some of the situations as a young person on my own with no kind of one to turn to or no help, it's mind blowing. Yeah. And how I got through so much, and I'm here now today, and here with him. Like this is a miracle.
Yeah.
13 years ago, the two of us, you would have said we would be dead within 12 months. Yeah. You know, because it'll carry on all of us, and for us to sit here today and have a conversation with yourself. Yeah. You know, and it's amazing.
Some change, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't say, and I really don't say this lightly, Tommy, but you know, you did the piece with Francis Arm yesterday. Yeah. The reaction from that, like, it's just like I was looking and said, Jesus, I got no coverage here. No, I'm only joking. Because what you said was so, like, it was so personal, first of all. A lot of people don't like, you know, to put themselves on show and to say what, you know, been through. And the reaction was just, like, we were so pleased, right? Because, you know, we do believe that, you know, people focus on, we'll say, people who are in the throes of taking drugs. But when you see what's possible, you know, in, we'll say, recovery, detox, and there's not enough of it. So that opportunity yesterday for you to talk from the heart was just so important.
I think what I got from it, Eddie, was just the authenticity. Yeah. It was so authentic. And just seeing, you could see that he's not somebody that stands in front of a camera every day. No. You know, and you could see a little bit of that, the vulnerability.
Yeah. Totally.
The words that were coming out of his mouth, and they were so true, because I know his journey and a big part of it, and as well as he is a big part of my journey. And just to listen to him, and I was very proud.
Oh, yeah, so you should be, and we were too. I mean, I remember meeting you last year at the Donors Day. Remember? And I always mix the two of you up. You know, like I always have to know who's Timmy, who's Tommy. You know, but I know when you sit together there,
I get called Tommy by a lot of people still.
But and like, even the way you talked about, you know, never give up hope. Like that's, you know, and I've heard that so many times. And you see people who are, you know, at a particularly bad place, you know, in a bad place, and like I'm sure we'll get to talk about Merchants Quay and the various bits and pieces we do, but you know, on the quays in Dublin is a really it's a difficult place. So you see people who are really in, and for them they don't have the hope. So for somebody like you to show your path and your journey, it does give a lot of hope to people, you know.
Yeah. It does, and it's amazing. You know, and you mentioned Merchants Quay, which is you're the CEO of. And it's a big gig. It's there's a lot of responsibility on your shoulders there as well, and I can imagine how challenging it can be because of what's going on in Dublin. There's a lot of people on the streets. The addiction is rampant. Yeah. You know, everywhere, not just Dublin.
Yeah.
And like, was it a difficult position to sit into initially?
Yes and no. Funny enough, an awful lot of the clients that use the city would know me. So they still call me governor. I say, lads, I'm not the governor. You're always the bleeding governor. But it's said in a very friendly and jovial way. Yeah. So from the transition point of view, I knew a lot of the clients and I knew a lot of the type of clients. So while they may not have, that of course they all didn't go to prison. Absolutely not. But they all have similar stories. They all would have come from, would say, poverty, okay, trauma, early childhood trauma. They would have seen, they would have, their childhood would have been robbed in many ways from them, and they're really struggling with that. So whether they were in prison or whether they're in the community, they still have the same kind of challenges. And I would have recognised that, as I say, not being noble about it, but I could very easily been in that position myself. I was very lucky. And I always remember people when we were kids, people who would come to the door. Now my father he worked for Smurfits, he was a fork truck driver. So he had a good paying job, but it was a blue collar job. It was hard work. He worked hours, lots of overtime. My mother stayed at home. And but I can remember people coming to the door and they'd be looking for, people not going to save you any money or whatever. And she never had any money, but she'd always give them something. Might be a bottle of milk. Like when you look back at it, people laugh, a bottle of milk, but that was the done thing. Bread, milk, might be anything that you could, a bowl of sugar. Yeah. But it was always, her philosophy was always, look, and I'm quite a religious person, but she would have always said, dare go I, but for the grace of God. It was a famous saying, but she really meant it because any of us could have been in that boat, So, so moving into Merchants Quay, I'm a year in now, and I have to say, I'm delighted with the decision. I really am. Sometimes it's frustrating because, the level of the problem, you kind of touched on the level of addiction, and it is everywhere. It's not just in Dublin or Cork or Limerick, but it's all over the country. Yeah. But it can be overwhelming at times, and like I'm lucky. I have a nice office, right? I'm not full on, I would say, on the coal face, as they say. Yeah. Every day I look at, a lot of our project workers and a lot of our staff that work with our clients, and it's stressful for both because, sometimes you think you're making progress and you see somebody in a good place today, tomorrow you come in and they're totally gone backwards and you're saying, are they making any progress? So it is, but I love it. Yeah. So that's the bottom line. I'm very happy with the decision. A lot of exciting stuff happening. Yeah. When you get the likes of Tommy to talk about his journey, that makes it all worthwhile.
And you mentioned as well yourself that there was over 200 people looking to get into Francis Farm. Yeah. And the capacity up there, I think, including the detox and
23.
And how long are those people there for? Is it 2 to 3 months?
So it's 12 weeks in the recovery, and it's 10 weeks in detox.
Yeah. Detox, yeah.
And what we try to do is you try to have somebody who comes into detox, because detox is quite tough. I'm sure I'm telling you, lads, it's very tough. It's very emotionally challenging as well. So important that the recovery is there immediately after detox. So you're not saying somebody comes in for detox and then there's a break, because that break is just, you've lost all the momentum that you've gained by getting in. So, and then the last piece, which a lot of people forget, is the aftercare piece. So when somebody has completed that recovery program, they're still very fragile, and going back out to an unstable environment, unstable accommodation. And let's be honest about it. And I'm saying this without the lived experience, but my observation would be that a lot of people who are in chaos like to see somebody who's done well drifting back into chaos. It's a natural thing. Yeah. It's not that it's not out of any badness. It's just that it takes their piece of metaphor.
It reminds them of where they are. Like it reminds them.
So a lot of people have said to me when they would finish a program that it's difficult, but not getting back into the environment, not going back to people that they might be your best friends, but they're not your best friends at this point in time. So that's why aftercare is so important. So if somebody gets, accommodation, opportunities to go to daycare programs, look at, maybe start looking at what I'd like to do next year. Would I like a job? Would I like to go back to college? Whatever it might be. And in order for a person to do that, they need a space. They need a kind of a safe space like aftercare. So we are certainly, we've upped our kind of advocacy around the importance of aftercare as well as recovery and detox. And there's just not enough in the country.
No, there's definitely not. I remember when I was in college doing a degree in construction management, there was this place in down towards Kerry, big building, an old boarding school, and I'd done a project on it. And my project was a residential treatment centre. And it would take maybe 100 beds and the renovations and all these different things, how many counsellors it would need and all the work. Because I was in recovery maybe 7 or 8 years at this stage. And I said, I do this project and I know how it was working. I do all this research. And I was getting, I said, fucking hell. Then I started thinking to myself, these facilities and premises are all over the country. And all it takes is to take maybe a few quid from maybe the civils in the country, like in relation to fixing roads and footpaths, because we seem to be fixing footpaths that have been fixed 2 years ago and pumping the money into these things and building these projects and trying to get a bit of stability into this country around recovery and treatment centres. We're so under-resourced in this country in relation to treatment. It's unbelievable.
I'm optimistic that there certainly is, like even we look at, we're in September now, Recovery Month. Every day there's something in the media around recovery and how recovery is real and how it's possible. Now, if you look back 5 years ago, nobody talked really about recovery. It's a slow burner, there's no doubt about it. I think we're slowly starting to make some inroads into it. We've a lot of work to do. We don't have enough recovery beds, and sometimes people don't see the connection. Like if somebody's is in a really bad place in relation to their drug use, right? And that's all the person focuses on. And in the community, they're looking and say, this. They don't see that, that there is hope. Like I remember saying to somebody there recently, the last published figures for deaths through addiction, I would say overdose, right, were 2020. There was 409 people passed away associated with addiction and associated with overdose. So it could have been a variety of overdoses. It wasn't all heroin, it wasn't all cocaine, whatever it was. But the headline figure was 409. Now, if 409 people, and when I say this, I certainly don't want to undermine or in any way, reduce the impact of road deaths. But as a country, we really do. We get very upset and we get very, emotional about the number of people who die on the roads. But twice the amount of people die in addiction. Yeah. And in some respects, it does look at the face of it as there's a kind of lesser value put on the people who die in addiction than there is. And that has to change. And, I mean, it's not about, we'll say, what's the word I'm trying to think? It's not about one life is more precious or less precious than another. Yeah. It's just that there needs to be an acknowledgement that, chronic addiction and overdose is an illness, is a chronic illness, And I think when people start to... now, the good thing is, like, if we work very close with the HSE. There's a really strong commitment in the HSE in social inclusion to really bring these figures down. And sometimes the public service and civil service get a bad rep. Really, they get a bad rap. But since I went into emergency care, like the most committed people are in the HSE as well as the voluntary sector. They want to see this come down. They want to see people supported through recovery. But they're fighting for budgets like everybody else, and that's where the problem is.
Yeah, and some of the best counsellors and people that you can probably have are people who've been through the system already. Yeah. And I know the prison at the moment are starting to employ people who have been to prison, and I think it's working out really, really well. And I think the benefit of lads that have been to prison and down that road, going and sharing their experiences and giving the lads a little pathway and giving them a hope. And because I remember when I was on my path, I believed the life that I was living was the only life for me. Mm-hmm. I didn't think that I was better. I could have anything else, because I was absolutely brainwashed into understanding what I had was the only thing I was ever going to get. And then when I look at my own kind of core beliefs about myself, like not being worthy, low self-esteem, low confidence, it justified everything, and it all kind of fit into place that this is what you have. You're probably not going to live past 30, and that was that's how I understood it. But then when I stopped and I started noticing that I don't have to behave like this anymore. I don't have to do this. And then I actually got my first job because I was looking for a job for a while. I couldn't get a job because of my criminal record and because of my reputation of being a drug dealer and all these different things. My whole life started to change. And I suppose then when I came clean about it, when I came clean on the podcast, the door just opened. It just opened for opportunities and people started to say, they started to appreciate my honesty and my life just took off in a different way.
But 5 years ago, you couldn't have gone into prison. 4 years ago, 3 years ago. 3 years ago, somebody who served a sentence could not come back into prison unless they come back into serving another sentence. They couldn't come in to talk to people about their lived experience. And then a few years ago, the penny dropped and people realised, so you'd have even me trying to sit and talk to you and tell you something about prison. How could I? I worked on one side of it. You were the person who spent the time. And we realised then, and in fairness, the Director General was very proactive about this, and let's change the way people who want to go back, who've served a sentence and want to come back and help others are probably the best people to talk about their journey, both within prison, which is kind of restricted, but more so how they navigated the release and how they got back on track, how they got into employment, all of those kind of things. Because we were trying to tell people what we thought was best, which just doesn't work. It's like trying to tell a child, this is best for you. They'll do the opposite, That was my view anyway,
And also, I think the IPS are starting to create little focus groups with lads who've been to prison to ask them their opinion. What do you think is the best thing we should do here? Instead of them going off their own beliefs, maybe around what's happened before or psychology or... and they're saying, right, let's bring the lads, because I was actually at a group recently up in County Meath with all the doctors, the nurses, the psychologists, and then there was a group of us who have lived experience. And we were sitting down at different tables, and I was sitting there with two governors. One was a trades governor, and another one was a governor. And we were just sitting there and we were just chatting amongst ourselves and talking about and they were always like, they'd say it, and then it was like, they'd come to me, and it was like they were all looking at me and giving me the answer. But it felt great to feel involved in something that will have massive change, and hopefully someday will change the whole kind of dynamic of how prisons work. Like, I'm part of the education task force as well.
That's right,
where we're trying to get apprenticeships into prison. What an absolute fantastic idea, because you have maybe 90%, 85 to 90% of the lads in prison who are undereducated and they love working with the hands. Eddie, you were a governor. What classes were packed and rafters inside in the schools?
Well, I suppose there's two things I say on that. Sometimes people underestimate how important school is in prison. Like, I would say, of all the prison, the best place in the prison, without a shadow of a doubt, is the education unit. Now, it is for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's a very safe and it's a very equal environment. So I always found, I don't think I ever met a teacher who treated anybody in prison, any way other than respectfully. There was always that respect. Mountjoy was a particularly unique one because Mountjoy is so chaotic in many respects. But when people went to the school, there would be a great atmosphere, and there'd be great mutual respect. But you're right, the art was a big one, music a big one. I can remember actually we did an event not long before I retired. It was called the Theatre of the Oppressed, and Lynn Rowan, the senator, so Senator Lynn Rowan was involved in it, and it was a really interesting concept, right? So what it was. Kind of role play, role reversal, right? But on this particular occasion, when the lads were getting ready so there was going to be a kind of a very big day, 2 concerts. Well, I'll call them concerts. They weren't concerts, but 2 acts, right? And so they were acting about. But in preparation for that, they used various guinea pigs. And on a particular day, I went into the school, and the Lynn and Grace Diaz, who were running the workshops, asked me to step in. And I said, here we go. And then, to be honest with you, I love all that cracking, so it wouldn't bother me in the slightest. But it was quite funny because we were in a double classroom and the camera was on, and it was an aggressive scene, right? So the staff were looking at this and wondering, now should they go in? Was I being attacked or was I not being attacked? Right? But it was a scene that happened in Portlaoise a number of years previously, and it was around. It was like a mini disturbance, okay? But the idea was to look at why this disturbance was happening, right? So in the first instance, I play myself as the governor. I go in, the lads are they're really aggrieved about a few bits and pieces, and they're giving it all to me. And I'm standing there trying to think, how do I deal with this? And that was quite normal. You get that all the time. But so then I had to step into the prisoner's role. And one of the highest profile guys at the time had to step into my role.
Yeah.
Now, I love acting. So I got fully immersed in this, and I was giving it socks, and the lads were loving it behind me. And your man didn't know what to do, you know. And afterwards, when we spoke, this is the serious side of it was, I could really see, and I remember buzzing for the day about this. I could see what he'd said was we could see the frustration and why they were frustrated and why they were acting the way they were acting. But he could equally see the limitations, you know, how little I could actually do to change the situation. It was down to resources, down to everything else. So there was a kind of an understanding. We both came away saying, you know, God, I got something out of that, you know. So it was a really good example of, you know, role reversal, obviously was what it was, but even thinking about, you know, sometimes things happen everything happens for a reason. It doesn't, not sometimes, everything happens for a reason. So if you look at the root cause and the reason why there might be issues, and if you can address them, you know, you can bring things down, you can make the environment a lot better for everyone. Now, that's a bit of a long-winded ramble, but it just came into my head.
Yeah, I remember you telling me that story before, and it's just, even like there's not many governors would put themselves in a position like that.
I suppose not.
So that says a lot about you.
Well, look, listen, there's nothing special about me. Yeah. I enjoyed that, you know, like people have their strengths and weaknesses. Others would say they do other things. So that's not this. Just I did enjoy it. It was good old crack, and you know, we had a good old laugh at it. You know?
Do you know now with your new position, and you've learned so much in the last 12 months around addiction and homelessness and everything else, has it gave you any insight into maybe how different things may work within prisons around addiction, and maybe implementing certain things around recovery, because you have learned a lot? Is there anything that, with the knowledge you have now, and you went back in as a governor in the morning, you would implement in prisons, maybe for the lads? As
you really put me on the spot here. There's one thing that maybe
I think that answer could potentially turn it to something as well.
Well, we're going to open a medically supervised injection facility, the first of its kind, right, in Merchants Quay later this year. It'll open hopefully early December. It will be early December. Yeah. And that is, in some people's view, that's enabling drug use. Okay, so you're in it, but it's not. What we're actually doing is, we know people use drugs. They come to our facility, our harm reduction facility. They get their needles, they get the paraphernalia they need, and then they go out onto the streets into very undignified, unsafe environments to take their drugs. People walking along the streets don't like it. They feel uncomfortable, right? But the people taking the drugs equally don't like it. They don't want to be on display for everybody to see, right? So this is going to open in December. And there's two opportunities. One is from a safety and health perspective. The person who's injecting drugs will have a nurse within the environment to keep an eye, to make sure that everything is okay. If somebody goes into a state of overdose, we can administer naloxone. We can do all of that. We can also have a conversation with the person. Yeah. You know, we can start. And a lot of people say when a person is in the depths of drug using, it's the hardest time to have a conversation. Yeah. It's about building a relationship. It's about getting a bit of trust. It's about all of that. So all of that is going to come with this. So if you look at that in a prison context, right? So you look, we all know there are drugs in prison. We all know, you know, and they're not just drugs in prisons. They're all over the world. Every prison in the world, even in some of the most restricted regimes in the world, they still have drugs. So drugs is an issue. So maybe the conversation needs to start about how we adopt a more harm reduction approach rather than a prohibitive approach. So if I was back in the prison tomorrow after a year with Merchants Quay, I'd certainly be starting those conversations, and I'd say, look, should we look at, and the best thing in a prison is to do a pilot. Okay, so what we're doing in Merchants Quay is a pilot. Okay, so pick a location and say, let's be grown up about this, and let's look and see, should we have some sort of a consumption room, a medically supervised injection facility, whatever it is, and educate people on that aspect of it, because a lot of prison deaths, a lot of people who die in prison die as a result of overdose, or there's usually, very often, and I'm not saying in all cases, but very often, there is some sort of a drug involved. Mm-hmm. And then most of people who die in prison die during the night. Okay, so somebody goes into a cell, they're on their own, they take drugs, they don't have the supports. So, what could be a normal overdose often ends up as a fatal overdose because there's nobody there to step in. So that's the conversation. I know that's not going to happen today or tomorrow, but at least everything starts with a conversation.
Exactly.
If we had the conversation, that might be something.
And I think when we were talking about drugs being in prison, I actually think it's very important that drugs are in prisons, okay? Because if they weren't in there, I don't know how a lot of people in prisons today would cope. And I mean that truly. Because if they didn't have that chase, that's something to run after, they're left with their thoughts. And usually it might be based in their thoughts about something from childhood or something that they may have done while they were caught up in addiction.
I kind of half disagree with you, Timmy, right? The reason I half disagree is because one of the things one of the real downsides to it is that, we'll say, first of all, the cost of drugs in prison is twice what it is in the community, right? So the intimidation, particularly on family members, either to bring drugs in or to pay for drugs, is a massive problem. And I remember getting a call from a woman in Dublin when I was in Mountjoy, and her son had been assaulted, and he was assaulted in the exercise yard, and she was more or less ringing up to give out to me because we hadn't told her he'd been assaulted, and she was having a pop at me and she said, look, my son, and I knew he was in the matter and all this, and I explained to her, look, in the normal course of events, unless it's a matter of life and death or something, we would not contact a family member because there's security issues around taking people to hospital and all of that. So, and when we had that conversation, she understood that. And then I said to her, so I said, now I'm going to ask her, why did she think he was assaulted? And she told me he was assaulted because he hadn't paid a drug debt. Now, it was only $7,000, right? Which is not in the grand scheme of things in terms of prison drugs, is probably feck all drugs, right? But there was a debt of $7,000, and she was bringing. This man had 2 children. Unfortunately, the mother of the 2 children had passed away from drugs, right? So the grandmother was looking after the 2 kids. So I'm assuming this woman could have been up around late 50s, 60s, right? And she was bringing the children to school, and a young girl approached her and told her, Johnny was assaulted in the exercise yard in Mountjoy, and he'll be killed the next time if you don't pay the debt. He'll be dead. So she went to moneylender, which is probably not a whole lot step above. She was probably the moneylender was probably the drug dealer as well, if the truth be known. So she went and borrowed the $7,000, and she had 2 other daughters, and she was explaining to me that the interest was just accumulating, and herself and the 2 daughters were paying the $7,000 off to the moneylender, and he used to turn up when they'd go to the post office to collect the social welfare. He would be there, and they would hand over the money. And then the saddest part about it was, she said that she stopped bringing the kids to school because she said, I was afraid that they'd be attacked, right?
That's the dark side.
That's the dark side. Now, I know the point you're making, and I know we always said, like, we unofficially we'd say, when there was plenty of drugs in the prison, it was always a quiet place, right? There's no doubt about it. But if you were to, on balance, if I was to reflect on it, I'd say they do much more harm than good.
They do, and.
But the antidote to that is, supports. So more addiction supports, more, particularly around counselling. And Merchants Quay provide counselling in the prisons, and we're looking at how we can enhance that and improve that, because we know the demand is there. We know we have waiting lists for people who want to see counsellors. And as I was saying, Tommy, yesterday, like, there's no point in telling somebody, I'll give you something in 2 months' time when the need is absolutely chronic and it's immediate. So we know that. So we have work to do as an organisation to work with the prison service, and we're very, there's a great collaboration there to see how we can be more effective in the services we provide. But you know, if I'm honest, I think I've seen so much hardship. You have too.
Yeah. And what you said there, I've heard that same story 100 times.
Yeah.
With different people, and it saddens me.
Yeah.
Really does. But what my point was, it's just based on maybe people bringing in their own quantities of drugs and using them, because you remember lockdown came in, no visitors. I'd say the prison struggled massively.
It was a
the amount of
terrible
suicide attempts, the amount of lads that did their source.
The isolation was horrendous. Like prison service, you know, we were held up in very high regard in terms of the level of infection that got into prisons. It was very low. You know, it was a very successful containment of COVID, but there's a massive price paid for it, you know. And I remember the Director General and the Director of Care and Rehabilitation, and a number of people coming in for a workshop in Mountjoy, and a group of prisoners presented on the impact of the lockdown and this isolation, the breakdown of family relationships and all that. And it really was, I mean, we all sat there very somber. You know, we were very proud in some respects, but we also knew that this had a huge impact on people. So you're right, it is.
Because even for me, I wasn't in prison during any lockdown, and like the best part of my day or my week was seeing my children. Yeah. You know, my wife used to travel straight up to Portlaoise every single week without fail, and it was just the best part of the week. I used to love it.
You lived
I lived for it, because to see the smile and the innocence on their faces
kept you going.
Kept me going.
Oh yeah. I've always said that one of the saddest places in a prison is a visiting box. You know, you go into the visiting box and you see, and we did in a number of prisons, we introduced more family-friendly visits. I remember going to IKEA with myself and the assistant governor in Loughan House. Went out to IKEA to buy. There used to be a fund from the tuck shop, and it was for prisoner supports. And we had a few bob in that, and we went out to IKEA to buy leather couches for the visits in Loughan. Right? And like it was like. And then I was proud. I was delighted with it. They looked like a sitting room. So we got, the old lamps that they have in IKEA. We had them plugged in, and they were paper. And one of the kids would come in and rip all the paper, and you'd have to go and buy more, Yeah. But it definitely made it a bit more normal for the kids. A normal environment, an abnormal environment, as normal as possible. Yeah. But in the medium secure prisons where it was the old visiting box, it's terrible. It was terrible to walk through.
Yeah.
The enhanced visits there when you're able to give your family member a hug.
I'm sure it makes such a difference.
It makes a massive difference.
Yeah.
Do you think your involvement within the Irish Prison Service made it a better place, Eddie?
I think you'd have to ask others that. I'd like to think I made, look at it, again, and I really have to say this, there's nothing special about me, there's nothing noble about me. I'd like to think I did my best. Yeah, certainly would. But I suppose I'll leave it at that in that respect. It's hard to know.
It's a good answer. Yeah. It's just like what my point really was is like you feel like that you actually made your purpose was done.
There's a couple of things that I would have been very proud of. I was very proud of the coffee shop in Loughan House. Right? So I remember going in, and there was a man serving a life sentence from Cork. He was a long time in the prison, and I remember he was in Loughan, and I remember going up to the coffee shop, and there were two very elderly women from the locality, so somewhere around Blackline, and they were sitting having a cup of tea, and he was sitting with them, and they were singing The Banks. Would you believe it? The Banks of all songs. Right? But obviously he was very proud of his heritage and his background. And I remember thinking, isn't this great? Like, where would you get this? They didn't know him. They didn't want to know anything about his crime or anything like that. But they just had the humanity to sit and talk to somebody who was in prison. So I was very proud of that. The Parkrun in Mountjoy was another great event. It wasn't it was a good Cork man, and Donncha Walsh, who was an assistant governor. Donncha, he was the man that had the brainchild for the Parkrun. I suppose the governor supported him when we got it up and running. And again, Saturday morning, people coming in from the community, and it was very competitive, the park run. So lads in the gym, they want to be the best. So when they were doing the park run, a prisoner always had to win, right? So even you get runners from running clubs, and they were very interested. There's a another good Cork man, Brian O'Connell, who's the RT journalist. Brian's a big runner. Brian came in several times and he ran with the lads. But when it was over, he'd go for a cup of tea and a chat. And because it was a nightmare for a prison governor, because everybody was in gym gear, so you were wondering who's going and who's staying, right? But because everybody was in gym gear, right, there was no barrier, right? So there was, and I always say sport and music are two fantastic barrier breakers, because if you're a good musician, you're a good musician regardless. If you're a good sports person, you're a good sports person regardless. And that was the great thing about the Parkrun. People were just interested in the run and interested in, you'd often get to talk about kids and all that kind of thing. But it was a very non-judgmental environment, and the lads loved it. And they still love it, So they're the kind of things that I look back fondly on. The visiting box, again, I was very proud of that in Loughan and the coffee shop. But yeah, they were there.
They're nice.
Highlights.
The coffee shop is sitting up the top of the hill here on the floors. You have the tree.
I'll give you a funny one. Fergal Black.
Yeah.
Well, Fergal and I would be good friends over the years, and Fergal was the director with responsibility for rehabilitation. And I had convinced Fergal that we needed to open a coffee shop, and there wasn't much convinced. He was very committed to all that, but there was a process obviously for getting the money for this. And we had the coffee shop in before he even approved it, right? And I kept ringing him saying, Fergal, I need to approve this. And yeah. And it was already in situ, so he's going to hear that now.
Yeah, Fergal done a lot of great work himself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you might remember the day in Dublin Castle. We were laughing, yourself and James were there, and Fergal and I were trying to compete to see who was the most working class. Do you remember?
I remember well. It's two of you from inner city, like.
Yeah. Fergal would be from, probably 2 kilometres away in the Cork Street direction, which is just off the Liberties as well. Yeah.
It was great to see.
He's Fergal's posh. Behind him, he'd tell you he is posh. He is posh.
He has did a little bit of a twang, all right, don't he? But listen, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Well, my pleasure, I have to say. And I always felt, I said, geez, when are they going to invite me to do this podcast? Because the who's who of I've done your podcast with you, so I'm delighted to be
had some
on the list
guests,
now. Thanks very much.
But even to have yourself there now and have the opposite side of it for like these podcasts are in the prisons as well, just to let you know. They're uploaded onto the prison channel and the lads get to listen to it, and it's fantastic because what we're doing is sharing other people's stories that have been down the road already, and the lads are getting a lot of inspiration from it. It's like putting an AA meeting into the prison, and that's what it is really, or an NA meeting, and there's a lot coming back from that as well. But we love it. We just love doing what we're doing, Eddie, and it's more like a hobby now and a passion for me these days. And coming from work and go here at the studio with Tommy and Tony and whoever else is here, and we have a bit of crack.
Yeah. Well, fair play, and thanks again. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Anything coming up that you'd like to mention?
Well, the MSIF, as I said, I was in Portugal on holidays last week, just myself and the wife, and I said, I'm here now. I was outside Lisbon. I'll go and have a look at the MSIF in Portugal. And the MSIF in Portugal is so medically supervised injection facility is what MSIF stands for. Some people call it supervised facility. The one in Portugal is that, but it also is a consumption room. But I reached out to the director of it when I was there, and in fairness, they facilitated a visit on the Monday while I was there. And it's a fantastic facility because it is a life-saving facility, and you have to look at it in that context. It absolutely is. But there's a funny incident when I arrived in. Got the tour, got a really good summary of how it works and, the challenges and, what they got right, what they got wrong, because that's what's all about, learning what, how to improve things. But they introduced me to a few clients, which I thought was really interesting because their clients in addiction are the same all over the world. They have the same challenges and the same issues. But Portuguese people they had English, right? So the only piece of Portuguese I have is obrigado, right? Which is thank you. Right? But they had they were able to converse really fluently with me in English, and they were explaining how good the facility was and all of that. And so I left, and I was going to try and get a taxi. My wife was in the city in Lisbon, and I was going to get a taxi back. And when I walked out, one of the clients came out, and it was like as if I was on O'Connor's. Eddie, he says, right, Portuguese guy. And I said, yeah. And he walked up to me and he says, would you buy me a coffee? right? So I often hear that, no, would you buy me a coffee? He says, yeah, no problem. There's a coffee shop maybe 50 yards down. Walk down with him to get the coffee. And as soon as we went in, he says, no, I don't want a coffee, I'll have a beer. Right? So a beer and an ice cream, right? And I thought it was, but it could have been, you could have been in Dublin, you could have been
anywhere at all.
Anywhere at all.
Get that anywhere.
Don't miss the opportunity.
Yeah. And you know what? Just roll with it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. The best part when I paid, so they got, it was only €4 or whatever. Yeah. And he says to me, I'll take the change as well. It's just when I only gave a tenner in. If it was 50, I was going to be down 50 euro. But you're right, just roll. Yeah. I get one last thing I'll tell you. I remember walking past Marks and Spencer's in Dublin, just beside Arnott's, so right in the heart of Henry Street. And there was a young girl, a homeless girl, I'd say she was in addiction, outside Marks and Spencer's, and she said, will you buy me a coffee? And no problem, that would never bother me now, coffee is a coffee. So I went in to buy a coffee, and there was a deal, right? So it was a coffee and a Marks and Spencer pack of biscuits. I love biscuits, I'm a terrible sweet tooth, so I said, I'll get 2 packets. And I came out and I gave her the coffee, and I held the 2, and I said, which one would you like? Now I swear to God, if you couldn't, the smile on her face that she was getting a packet of biscuits, and it was a simple thing, and just a fucking biscuit.
Yeah.
So it just shows, And I remember Peter McFerry saying this one time, he was on some program and he was saying, an acknowledgement is even more important than giving somebody who's, really at the depths of, despair, right? Yeah. Somebody sitting on the street. Acknowledge, even if you because so few people carry cash now, right? So, and I don't carry much cash, I never carry cash. So you often get caught out where you can't give somebody something because you don't have it. Yeah. But even saying, look, sorry, I don't have a bob on me, you'll just get there. Because it's so important to acknowledge people.
It is, isn't it? 100%. And I just want to kind of comment on what you said about people on the streets, begging and looking, whatever. Like if anybody listening here just tries to understand what it must feel like to be sitting down with a cup on Patrick Street or O'Connell Street or wherever it may be, to be able to get money to feed your habit. Yeah. Can you imagine how shameful that must feel for anybody to do it? That's what it is. And even though when I'm passing somebody, and if I have money in my pocket, I'll always give them money. Even though I know it's going for a bag of gear or a few cans, I don't matter.
No, I agree with you.
What comes into my head is that you're getting them up off that fucking shitty, wet, cold floor for an hour or two, taking the shame that they're going to feel for the next hour or two, sitting on the floor away from them. And it doesn't matter if they were
I
going
agree
away
with
for
you.
food.
And I mean, who is any of us to judge? I've often had conversations with people and we'd often be arguing about, well, I don't mind giving to a charity or I don't mind, but I'm not too comfortable giving to someone in the street. And I say, why?
I prefer to give it to them than
absolutely.
Charity.
It's gone directly to the
you
person.
You make them happy for a few minutes.
And the smile, the smile in their face. Yeah. Do you know the smile when you give them whatever you're going to give them, in the smile in their face, and they're looking just this.
I'm human.
Disbelievement.
Yeah.
And then they say, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I mean, as I say,
it's powerful.
That girl was, I mean, that was stuck with me for the day, and they're just because I gave her the choice of either a white chocolate or a dark chocolate biscuit.
And it was the choice you gave her.
Yeah, and she took the right one because I wanted the white chocolate.
Give me them. Yeah. Give me back them. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, you too. And thanks very much.
Listen, you were fantastic answering all the questions we had, and it was just great to talk about some of the prison stuff.
I'm delighted.
A lot of people would like to know because they don't really hear a governor's story too much, And
are we done?
Yeah, we're done. So we're going to call it a day. Listen, thanks to everybody for home for listening. I'm Timmy from the long way back. Tommy,
thanks, lads.
God bless.